Well, I've changed the title as well. It's not that it's any shorter. However, we were just in a workshop for the last couple of days, and the discussion was that you wanted to get to the point. Well, I have to beg your indulgence then, because I was a construction worker for 20 years, and I wear the academic mantle, although perhaps I put on a nice coat. I'm never very comfortable as an academic, but so if you allow me to speak more as a construction worker, perhaps I can get more to the point. Yeah. So in thinking about this chapter, or thinking about sort of future research, I think it would be much better called, if we were to be a construction worker about it, it would be a title for it would be "What the Fuck, Damned If You Do and Fucked If You Don't, Unions and Politics in Canada." And this is the sort of question I think that we could perhaps ask to the panelists this morning, because if you're facing financialized and globalized capital, if you're facing a global climate crisis, if you're facing Donald Trump and Brexiteers and neo-right fascism everywhere, you have huge problems before us. And the problems don't seem to be getting away, and they don't seem to be getting any better, and in fact it all seems to be getting a whole lot fucking worse. And I think that kind of despair is quite widespread. You talk to union leaders, some union leaders will say, well, what can we do? Other union leaders will say, politics are fucked. I don't give a rat's ass about politics. I can only do this unionized work. You talk to union leaders in Canada, especially in Ontario, one of the case studies that I talked about. Well, do you think that the two of you could get together to support a minimum wage campaign? Well, we're not working with so-and-so, I can tell you that right now. Can we work together on a political campaign? No, our members, right, some of them are going to be voting Tory, some are voting Liberal. We can't say a thing. And you go, you have got to be kidding me. Because you are in a situation of losing members. You are in a situation of the fragmentation of workforces. You are in a situation of massive tax cuts and support for business. And you're saying you can't say anything because you're afraid of offending members? You can't talk to another union? Well, these sort of things sort of begin to think, well, how is it that we can begin to talk about this anyway? So I think, at least if nothing else, that I would like to sort of put together an academic framework that maybe puts it on a more abstract and perhaps a nicer sort of institutional way, talking about union repertoires of political contention. And then I would hope that maybe if we begin to think about this and talk about this and say that there are different strategies that we can take from social movements, and that there's a number of ways that we can put together political pressure, and that there's benefits of working together to deal with these big kinds of problems that we all face, then maybe we can begin to make some steps forward, and that we're not going to see, after an election of Obama, immediately a Donald Trump arise, right? So that we begin to make steps forward instead of taking one step forward and then taking 8 steps back and making it more difficult for us. So I think, as Judy Fudge and Peter mentioned quite well, that there's our big problems of neoliberalism and globalization. But what it means for unions is this real loss of members. It means a loss of organizational resources. It means, and how do you then cope then with the fact that you have to be involved in politics? Similarly, free trade agreements and international investment agreements and the globalization of networks means that now unions have to compete for investment. They have to compete to give concessions to corporations to maintain sorts of jobs. That suddenly puts and pits unions against one another. Unions themselves then lose that kind of community presence that they once had, both with in terms of the loss of members, but also in terms of what their actual interests are. They no longer are thinking about themselves as perhaps defending a wider community interest. They're thinking about how their union can protect a job and how they can protect a certain kind of wage or benefit system. And I think the real problem, one of the big, huge problems that I think both unions and the left have faced, has been this decline of any kind of real linkage then between unions and social democratic parties. There was always tremendous fights and political conflicts throughout the 20th century, and this is especially the case in Canada. But every one of those unions had a political project of one kind or another. That's no longer on the agenda. And I think that's a real problem that we face. Because in doing that, now unions and labor movements and progressive movements and new social movements face things like labor market deregulation. They face things that democracy is now being run by business, for business, of business. And they face that the fact that these issues around full-time jobs or good jobs or sustainable employment or a good environmentally sustainable future are all off the table, because we're now all about competition. We're now all about trying to increase capital. We're all about trying to increase growth. And I think in our analysis of union revitalization, lots of people, and I think unions themselves, have taken on board the fact that they have to do more organizing. They have to do mergers so that they can better have the resources to represent and deal with people. Unions are much more transnational. We have lots of studies about how they're trying to create more transnational, international bargaining structures. There's much more work on corporate campaigns and living wage campaigns, and we have very excellent examples recently of the improvements for living wage campaigns across. But the discussions about politics seem to be completely off the table. And I think they are off the table because of this kind of depression, this kind of frustration that working people, but unions themselves, are facing. So typically when we still talk about political action, I think it's still in these very narrow and very fragmented kinds of ways. Unions themselves are gone off by themselves to say, well, we're going to lobby on this kind of issue. The CAW and Unifor now lobby specifically to say, what kind of carve-out can we get in the free trade agreement? What kind of special investment can we get? We have more targeted political finance campaigns. The Democrats and some of the unions in the states try to support those particular candidates who might have a chance of winning. We have single-issue advocacy campaigns around health coalitions and anti-privatization. We have living wage campaigns. We have all of these individual campaigns. But if you look at the bigger kind of picture about what's happening, yes, there's single issue wins. Yes, sometimes you can put a reform off. But then suddenly 2 years later, you're back in the situation where there are now 2,000 anti-public sector pieces of legislation before you. Yes, some of those places have had a minimum wage increase. But as we have just seen in Ontario, a government passed a minimum wage bill that was going to see consecutive kinds of minimum wages. Well, all of that is gutted. Suddenly you're back at square one again. So I think about trying to think about, well, how can we begin to put something back together again that might be able to help us think and maybe talk about unions, but also talk to unions, and perhaps also provide some basis that we might be able to criticize unions or talk about different kinds of trajectories. And I think that looking at some of the social movement literature, Doug McAdam and Hilary Boudet, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. They talk about environmental protest movements, primarily in the United States, almost entirely against fracking, in some cases against oil and gas or pipeline movements. And they say we have to look at what kinds of political actions can people do? What kinds of political opportunities are available for them? Are there elections? Are there particular governments that are vulnerable? Has this area been upswing or downswing? What can we do to take advantage of those kinds of situations? What kinds of political actions can we do? Well, that depends on what they call civic capacity, but I think we should be able to think about what union capacities we have. And not just think about what the memberships are, but also think about what is the cooperation, what's the coordination between unions on political issues, on forcing political change. Does that exist? Is there some possibility for wider strategic action that is taking place over time? And then if you begin to think about how is it that unions can make stress? How can social movements do it? Well, they do it by building solidarity. And I think the campaigns that we've seen recently, whether it's the Fight for 15, the Fair B&B campaigns, the Keep It in the Ground campaigns, those show that there are success. But as the history of the 20th century, and especially that after the World War II, has shown, where unions made the most gains and where working people made the most gains was when it was actually a political movement as well. A movement for an egalitarian future, a social democratic future, a socialist future, a democratic future. And I think by taking those kinds of politics and those kinds of repertoires off the ground and off the agendas for so many unions, I think we're selling all ourselves in the union short, but we're selling ourselves as citizens short as well. But if you begin to think about these repertoires of political action, capacity, solidarity building, then you have to think, how is it then that those labor movements and political movements can get sticks on government to be able to force change, but also then how they can provide a carrot. And I think these are very sorts of powerful ways. And yeah, some of that's kind of cobbled together. But I think if we can begin to open that kind of discussion about how we think about political action on this wider scale, we can begin to think about what unions are doing and what they need to do. Now, I just want to point, in terms of my sort of case studies, we're looking at two provinces in Canada. One, the sort of the industrial and the financial heartland, which is Ontario. The other one, which is a very small and resource-dependent province that suddenly hit the oil jackpot with offshore oil in the 1990s and 2000s. And they took there's been two very different kinds of political trajectories and political actions that have been involved. One has been this completely fragmented and divisive, and of what one other friend of mine calls a civil war between labor about what they should be doing. None of them have been able to agree on anything about, and that then has implications for the Federation of Labor and has implications for the kinds of fragmented campaigns that unions run. On the other hand, which is completely, I think, novel for a North American context, has been a partnership, sort of strategic partnership model which emerges in Newfoundland. All of the unions agreed to be politically neutral. There's very few divisions between unions during this time, and it takes some time to sort of move forward. But unions then to say, well, look, we need to get real benefits out of this oil boom, and we should all engage in a strategic partnership. Well, for much of the labor movement in North America, this idea of partnership, it's completely off the table. But here, these unions, the construction workers, who have never thought that there was anything to be had in a partnership agreement, as well as across the public sector, and some of the most radical of the public sector unions also agreed to this kind of partnership and model as well and stayed out of politics, but then took strikes to win and use what they gained in a strategic partnership way to further it. And you can see, perhaps, in a general sense, what some of the outcomes were. Newfoundland's union density has been much higher, and it certainly is still the highest in Canada. Private sector density is also steady and continued to maintain steadiness. Ontario's private sector density continues to go in sharp decline. Interestingly enough, you also see that in Newfoundland, union coverage for those who are age 15 to 24 has at least followed not a general trend, but certainly more of an upward trend. And if you look at organizing of those workers who are in the private temporary sector and in temporary part-time or non-standard employment, it's gone from 20% to about 35% as of 2014. Ontario, still steady, but certainly it doesn't show much prospects, but it's almost 3 times the level of terms of organizing for temporary workers. How do they put this together? Well, I can't give you all the sort of details, but certainly that unions are able to win partnership with the government through a tripartite council, which is not necessarily new to any Europeanists here, but it's certainly new for that in Canada. Also completely new is that the unions actually win control and more or less delivery of all apprenticeship and training in the province. Either directly or indirectly, they gain control over most of the training and a skilled training in the province as well. Lobbying doesn't take place, but the unions themselves, both in the construction industry but also in the public sector, have opened doors to ministers during this time. And unions all maintain this principle of complete political neutrality. Nonetheless, they get centralized tables in construction and the public sector, many of which then have informal ties with the government as well. So it's a very different kind of model that we see some success. And that goes, okay, you go think, well, that's a very nice story. Suddenly partnership works in Canada. Well, this is where the what the fuck happens, okay? Because it's clear that it doesn't. Because after the downturn of oil prices in 2012, the Strategic Partnership Council is kiboshed. There's massive job layoffs in the public sector. There's massive cutbacks in public expenditure. The big construction projects all begin to wind up. Unemployment has now soared again, once again, in Newfoundland. The boom has gone bust, as the Globe and Mail here, this is one of our sort of national newspapers, reports. So this idea that institutional experimentation with partnership is going to be a silver bullet certainly turned to be something rather different. So I think if we begin to think about repertoires of political contention, this is a way of reopening these debates about what kinds of political actions unions need to take and what they could take. And as the IPCC has reminded us, we need to think very seriously about the big challenges before us. we need to think about what kinds of political actions we can take together, what kinds of new political coalitions we can forge. And by thinking about maybe repertoires, this might be just a first little step to try and getting past some of those old divisions and begin to discussing about how to move unions and citizens and politics towards a more progressive future. Thank you very much.